I was miserable. What a fool I had been. Why had I come here? Why hadn't I refused this invitation like a man and spent my Christmas in my chambers, or with my old maiden aunt in Drearington, or anywhere but just here, where I knew I should be so unspeakably miserable? You need not sneer and snigger, my doughty reader. You've been in love yourself, don't tell me, and if you haven't, you ought to have been, and if you have, you ought to know better. And once more, if you haven't, then don't read my story, but leave it to your betters. I shall never forget that New Year's Eve at Mount Edgemont, for the simple reason that I had never felt more miserable in my life. Mount Edgemont, as the reader probably knows, is the principal seat of the Duke of Teignmouth, and one of the oldest family estates in England. Reginald de Lisle, the Duke of Teignmouth's only son, and I had been chums at Eton. Evelyn de Lisle, the Duke of Teignmouth's only daughter and Reggie's younger sister, the sweetest girl that ever breathed, had in former days been, well, a sort of chum of mine too, when I used to spend part of my holidays with Reggie at Mount Edgemont. I was an orphan, by name Ralph Morton. My family was a fairly good one, but unfortunately nothing to compare with the de Lisles, who belonged to the very highest of the land. I had a fair position in the civil service, and a private income of about 400 a year, all very pleasant to a man of ordinary aspirations, but terribly inadequate to one whose friends are heirs to dukedoms and baronies, and who has the misfortune to lose his heart to one of the richest and proudest heiresses in England. Evelyn de Lisle had always liked me, I knew, and perhaps if I had ventured to push myself, this liking might have ripened later on into something deeper. But how would it have ended? I knew the Duke of Teignmouth and his family pride and prejudice only too well. He was as kind-hearted a man in his way as one could ever wish to meet, but still, he never let you forget that he was the Grand Seigneur, and that there was a certain limit beyond which no advance was possible with him. As for Lady Evelyn herself, what she would have said or done had she known of my hopeless passion, I never ventured to consider. We had always been staunch friends, and even after my school days were over and we met as full-grown mortals in London society, and on other occasions, she never dropped the old cordial tone towards me. But the moment I felt whither I was drifting, I exerted all my power of will and drew back. Alas, to no purpose so far as my happiness was concerned. I had told myself that I was a fool, and yet grew more miserable from day to day. I had sworn I would never set foot again in Mount Edgemont or any other possession of the Duke of Teignmouth's, and kept my oath for 2 years, at the risk of mortally offending my best friend Reginald de Lisle. I had even eschewed society, and refused invitations to houses where I knew I should meet Evelyn. In short, I had accomplished unheard-of sacrifices in my heroic resolve to conquer a hopeless passion. And yet here I was at last again under her own father's roof, more miserable than ever, and worse of all, I knew I had given grave offence to Lady Evelyn herself, who had noticed my reticent manner towards her, and not knowing its cause, had naturally attributed it to coldness, unfriendliness, or heaven knows what. To increase my martyrdom, I had now learned, nay seen with my own eyes, that I had a rival in the field, as if that made any difference indeed. And yet I had reasons other than those of mere jealousy to brood despairingly over this fatal circumstance. Lord Bertie Goring, who seemed generally recognised as the successful suitor for Evelyn de Lisle's hand, was an old Etonian like Reggie and myself. He was what is commonly known among young men as a good sort after all, a term which is admittedly an apologetic one and implies a notwithstanding with a more or less long tail behind it. Thus I was well aware that Bertie Goring was an inveterate gambler, a hard drinker, and generally a fast liver in every sense of the term. To see Evelyn smile upon this man, who was confoundedly good-looking too, and to know that the match between her and him was practically as settled as such things can be, without the actual ratification of the contracting parties themselves. Why, goodness me, need I dilate any further on all it meant for me? On that New Year's Eve there was a grand costume ball at Mount Edgemont. I had danced once with Evelyn, and had been refused a second dance rather coldly and haughtily. Thereupon I had placed myself, fool as I was, in a position where I could see and watch the progress of Bertie Goring's courtship. There were about 200 guests at the ball, 30 of whom, and I amongst the number, were staying at the castle. As the night wore on, I could bear the hateful strain no longer, and taking a suitable opportunity, I slipped away from the gay throng downstairs, and betook myself to the smoking room in the eastern tower, where I passed a quarter of an hour or so in giving expression to the sentiments recorded in the first paragraph of this story. Solitude is wonderfully solacing to a sick heart, and this room was so remote from the bustle and gaiety I had left that I might have fancied myself hundreds of miles away from the scene of my sufferings. Knowing that none of my fellow guests were likely to find their way through the intricate passages and corridors to this rarely visited wing of the immense mansion, I abandoned myself unreservedly to the thoughts that were tormenting me, and sat for a long while, with my arms spread on the table and my face buried in them, in an attitude, in short, which foolish people with my complaint are wont to assume on such occasions. After a while, the stillness of the place, which was only dimly lighted by one lamp with red glass hanging from the centre of the ceiling, began to tell upon my feelings, but in a curious way. While it calmed me in one respect, it seemed to impart to me a sense of unrest, which I should find difficult to explain. It struck me of a sudden that I should be missed at the ball, and that my retirement to this secluded corner of the castle would appear strange. As this thought occurred to me, I raised my head with the intention of going back and fighting out my trouble resolutely and with a calm front. There was nothing I dreaded so much indeed as to see the real state of my mind exposed to other eyes. To my consternation, however, I found that when I looked up I was no longer the only occupant of the room. I blushed as I thought of the position in which I had been discovered, but the next instant I started up with an exclamation of absolute dismay, for incredible though it seemed, my first impression was that the person sitting on the opposite side of the table, with his eyes fixed upon me with a steady, earnest gaze, was no other than the Duke of Teignmouth himself. Yet it was impossible. I remembered having seen the Duke downstairs in the costume of a Spanish grandee, while this personage was dressed like an English cavalier of the 16th century. The likeness, nevertheless, was so startling that it fairly took my breath away, and I stood for a considerable while staring open-mouthed at the motionless figure in front of me. Who could it be? And how could he have entered the room without my observing him? That he was not one of the more intimate guests of the evening was certain, else I should have known him, and yet for a stranger to the house to have found his way unaided through all those labyrinthine corridors to this lonesome spot appeared next to impossible. All these reflections passed through my mind quite slowly, and an uncanny sensation followed in their wake, for while I thus stared and reflected, my companion never once took his eyes off my face, but sat there, rigid like a figure in wax, save for that steady, piercing gaze I have mentioned, which gave his countenance something lifelike and real. At last I could stand the oppressive silence no longer. After all, we could not remain sitting opposite one another trying to stare each other out of countenance for the rest of the night. "That is a marvellous get-up of yours," I ventured to remark at last by way of opening up a conversation. My own costume was that of a Spanish toreador. "I wonder I never noticed you downstairs." But in lieu of a reply, my strange companion merely inclined his head very gravely, without, however, removing his eyes from my face, then rose from his chair, stood for a moment drawn up to his full height, which was very imposing, and then, again without turning his head away from me, glided slowly and perfectly noiselessly out of the room. The effect of all this upon me was so thrilling that I felt a shiver pass through my body, from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet, and in my agitation I started up, overthrowing my chair, and seized by an irresistible impulse, rushed to the door and out into the passage in pursuit of my strange visitant. The passage led to a winding staircase which descended to the eastern wing of the castle, upon which the tower was built. At the top of this staircase I saw the strange figure, with its head still turned towards me as before, waiting apparently in anticipation of my following it. I am not of a timid disposition in ordinary parlance, but in this instance I have no hesitation in admitting that a sensation of absolute fear crept over me, and I stood for a moment irresolute whether to advance or to go back to the room I had left. But before I could make up my mind either way, the figure moved on again, descending the stairs in the same gliding, noiseless fashion in which it had passed out of the smoking room, and obeying the same impulse as before, I moved on likewise, now however rather led than pursuing. I thought I knew the ins and outs of Mount Edgemont perfectly, having spent many a summer and winter vacation during my school days in exploring every nook and corner of the magnificent old castle with Reggie. But it became evident to me now that I had a guide whose knowledge of its intricacies was far superior to my own, We passed swiftly through a maze of doors and rooms and corridors, for the most part dark or very sparely lighted, now turning abruptly into some passage which apparently led to nowhere in particular, now mounting or descending staircases the locality of which I was already far too bewildered to remember. Presently I could distinguish the strains of the dance music and the hum of the guests in the distance, and knew that we were approaching the scene of the festivity. Was my strange companion going to mix boldly with the gay throng below? For a moment it shot across my mind that the whole thing might be some practical joke perpetrated at my expense by Reggie himself, who was rather addicted to this questionable species of fun. But I was soon undeceived. Of a sudden my guide halted at the end of a wide corridor, and as if his movements and mine were in some way interdependent, I too came to an abrupt standstill. Where we were I knew not, for I had entirely lost my sense of locality, but I could see that 6 or 7 paces ahead of me, where the figure remained stationary, there was a door which stood slightly ajar, letting a flood of light into the passage. As I stood and gazed, the somewhat grim features of the figure, which I could plainly distinguish in the light from the half-open door, relaxed into a kindly smile, as if inviting me to advance. Hesitating no longer, I rushed forward precipitately, but too late. Before I reached the spot, the figure had vanished. Without considering what I was doing, I pushed open the door through which I felt certain it had passed, and burst into the room, determined at any cost to follow and gain speech of my strange acquaintance. But the sight that met my view here made me start back in confusion. The room, fairly sized and luxuriously furnished, was lighted up by a profusion of taper candles. At the further end was a huge mirror, reaching almost to the ceiling, and in front of it, tranquilly engaged in fastening a fresh rose in her hair, stood Evelyn de Lisle. She turned around with a little start as I entered. "Mr. Morton!" she exclaimed in a tone of surprise. I beg your pardon," I stammered, greatly embarrassed. I believed. Surely he entered here." And I looked round the room dumbfounded. There was no trace of anyone else there. "He? Who?" she asked, following my astonished glance. I felt dreadfully foolish. What was I to say? I had committed an unpardonable breach of good manners. This was Lady Evelyn's boudoir, as I now recognised, and I had burst in upon her in this rude and unceremonious fashion, like some crazed being. There was nothing for it but to confess my folly, and make such excuses for myself as I could. "Lady Evelyn," I said, "I hardly know how to explain, but I believe I have seen a ghost." She turned pale. "A ghost?" she said tremulously. "What was it like?" I told her of my adventure, to which she listened at first gravely, but as I proceeded she turned her head away and toyed nervously with the lace of her dress. It struck me that she looked confused, and a chance glance at the reflection of her face in the mirror showed me that it was covered with blushes. I cannot describe the sensation the discovery produced in me. Had I been fooled after all, and did she know it? I scarcely dared to pursue the thought, and after I had finished my story I waited in silence for her to speak. The pause that ensued was painfully embarrassing to me, but presently she turned her face and looked at me with a curiously arch expression. "You say you went alone to the smoking room in the tower?" she asked. "Yes," I answered. "And stayed there quite alone for nearly half an hour?" Again I answered affirmatively. "Why?" she asked with a brevity which disconcerted me not a little. "I hardly know," I replied, trying to look innocent. I felt a little out of sorts and went there to have a few minutes' quiet. The answer seemed to satisfy her, and she remained silent for a moment. "Lady Evelyn," I said, "if I have been made the subject of a practical joke, I would take it as a favour if you would tell me so." "A practical joke?" she said reflectively. "No, I think not." Then breaking off with a little embarrassed laugh, she asked, "Are you quite sure the figure you saw smiled at you?" "Distinctly," I answered, and thinking it best to treat the matter lightly, I added, "On the whole, I must acknowledge that the ghost, if it was one, behaved most amiably." "It does not always do so," she said, "but I am glad it was pleasant. For your sake," she added, as if with an afterthought, and again I saw a deep blush tinge her cheeks, which made me feel uncomfortably suspicious of having been tricked. "Perhaps as you are here, Mr. Morton," she continued before I could speak, "you won't mind taking me down to the ballroom, unless you wish to resume your solitary musings in the smoking room." There was something so provokingly roguish in these words, and yet her manner in expressing them was so embarrassed and timid, that I felt at a loss for an answer. I gave her my arm, and we made our way in silence through the corridor which I had traversed only a few minutes before, and which I now saw led to the picture gallery adjoining the grand staircase. There were a few couples roaming about the gallery as we crossed it, and at the opposite side I recognised Bertie Goring, wandering from niche to niche with a disconsolate air. Lady Evelyn saw him too, and stopping suddenly, turned back as if to pass out of the gallery by another door. It was evident that she wished to elude him, a circumstance that made my heart leap with a wicked joy. But the manoeuvre came too late, and in another moment he overtook us and claimed her as his partner. I bowed silently, and Lady Evelyn transferred her arm from me to him. As she did so, however, she remarked, drawing forth her dancing card, "Let me see. Our next dance is the second after this, I think, Mr. Morton. You will find me near the fountain in the conservatory." Saying which, she deliberately drew her pencil through the name standing against the dance in question on her card, and left me standing in a transport of surprise and pleasure. How long I remained in that attitude I can't say, but I was aroused presently by a well-known voice at my elbow saying, "Well, Morton, you look quite awestruck. What has happened?" It was the Duke himself, Evelyn's father. Recollecting myself instantly, I put on a laughing face and replied, "You will hardly believe it, sir, but I've just seen a ghost." The effect of my words was an unexpected one. "What do you mean, Morton?" His Grace said almost sternly. "I trust you are joking." "If it is a joke, sir," I answered, rather nettled by his curt tone, "it is certainly not of my making." And I related my adventure, discreetly omitting, however, to mention the fact of its having terminated with my intrusion into Lady Evelyn's boudoir. The Duke listened with a frown that grew deeper as I proceeded. When I had finished, he looked at me for a moment keenly. Then, turning sharply on his heel, he said, "Have the goodness to follow me, Mr. Morton." I obeyed silently, and he led me round the great gallery, stopping at last before a huge painting set in an ancient framing, which did not hang on the wall like the others, but was let into the stonework like a frieze. Pointing to it, he said, "Was the person you saw anything like that?" "The very man, by Jove!" I exclaimed, forgetting all my formality in my surprise at the likeness, which was indeed striking. I saw the Duke start slightly and give me a look of displeasure. "I beg, then," he said coldly, "that you will forget what you have seen, Mr. Morton, and above all that you will not speak about it to anyone, whether it be a member of my family or not. It is not agreeable to me that my guests should meet with adventures of this description under my roof." With these words he left me considerably perplexed. This was turning the tables with a vengeance, I thought. After all, it was not I who had sought the ghost's acquaintance, it was the ghost who had sought mine, and why this fact should call his Grace's wrath down upon my head, I was at a loss to conceive. I consoled myself, however, with the thought of Lady Evelyn and her spontaneous concession of the dance she had refused me at the commencement of the evening, and soon forgot all about this little incident. As soon as the appointed time arrived, I hastened to the conservatory, where I found Lady Evelyn already awaiting me. She rose as I approached, and placing her arm in mine, suggested that we should sit out the dance. There was a shyness in her manner, so unlike her, and yet a certain assurance withal that made my very heartstrings quiver. I remembered having had a similar sensation 2 years before, when I was first seized with my mad infatuation, and withdrew to save myself from the misery of a passion which I felt to be hopeless. Ah, how ill-bred and churlish she must have thought me, and yet here I was again at her side, as madly in love as ever. "Mr. Morton," she said as we moved on, "I wanted to ask you not to tell anyone about what happened to you an hour ago. If you don't mind, I should prefer that it remained between you and me." "But I have already told His Grace, Lady Evelyn," I said with some dismay. "Had I only known—" "My father!" she exclaimed. "How very unfortunate. And did he seem surprised?" "I think he was annoyed, Lady Evelyn. My adventure appeared to displease him greatly, though it must be admitted that it was not of my seeking." "Perhaps he thinks differently," she answered. Her tone seemed to imply that she herself was inclined to think differently, which only tended to increase my surprise. But before I could ask her for an explanation, our short tete-a-tete was brought to a premature end by the sudden appearance of the Duke himself. He approached us hurriedly from a side entrance, and addressing his daughter, told her somewhat peremptorily that she was wanted in the ballroom. "I am sorry I must ask you to resign Lady Evelyn to me, Mr. Morton," he said, turning to me with the same look of haughty displeasure which his face had worn when he parted from me in the picture gallery. "Some of our guests are leaving, and my daughter has to perform her duties as hostess." And without waiting for me to reply, he gave his arm to Lady Evelyn and led her away. I stood utterly perplexed, the more so as I thought I noticed an abashed look on Lady Evelyn's face as she left the conservatory on her father's arm. What was the meaning of it all? What had I done to incur the anger of one who, ever since I was a boy, had always treated me with almost fatherly kindness, and had liked me too, for Reggie had often told me so? I began to feel myself the victim of some extraordinary mystery, but if this unpleasant incident caused me trouble, what now followed affected me far more deeply. I saw no more of Lady Evelyn that night, but the next day and the day after, I could not but feel that my presence at Mount Edgemont had become distasteful to its proprietor. His manner towards me was as cold and distant as was compatible with the politeness of a host, and what annoyed and puzzled me more than anything else, he seemed to be incessantly on the watch to prevent any meeting between me and Lady Evelyn. Such a state of affairs was unendurable for any length of time, and at last I made up my mind to leave Mount Edgemont. When I told Reggie that I found myself obliged to return to town on the following day, a look of relief came into his face. Then he suddenly placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Ralph, old fellow, why did you never tell me about this?" "About what?" I asked, surprised at his sudden burst of feeling. "I mean about this unfortunate attachment." "Attachment? What are you talking about?" Reggie looked at me with a quiet smile. "Ralph, my boy," he said, "I can't tell you how sorry I am. If she were in my giving, you should have her. That's all I can say. But you know the governor's strong notions on the subject. If he had struck me a sudden blow with his clenched hand, it could not have staggered me more than his words did." "How do you know?" I stammered. "The governor told me himself," he said. "The Duke!" I exclaimed. "Impossible. Why, not even Evelyn herself dreams." The look of comic compassion with which he received my words made me redden with shame. I saw it all instantly. My secret had been betrayed, was perhaps the common property of the guests assembled at Mount Edgemont. By what means it had become so I knew not, nor dared consider. But the idea itself was maddening, above all on account of Evelyn herself, for, great powers, what a confounded fool she must think me. I could not trust myself to say any more to Reggie, and left him in a frame of mind which I will leave the reader to imagine. How I passed the remainder of that day I don't remember. I only know I sought an interview with the Duke, and informed him of my intention to depart on the morrow. Nothing else passed between us, but his manner was unusually kind, and I think he felt sorry for me. Lady Evelyn did not appear downstairs at all that day. She was indisposed, it was said, but my own belief was that she preferred not to meet me again. To add to my mortification, I learned that Lord Bertie Goring had been closeted with the Duke for nearly an hour that morning, and had presumably made his formal proposal for the hand of Lady Evelyn. At last the night came, and I was able to escape from the company which had become a veritable torment to me. Ah, what a night it proved! The room I occupied was situated in the left wing of the castle, which was of comparatively modern build. Although I had retired to rest early, it was some time past midnight before I fell into a troubled sleep. There was one dream in particular which haunted me, recurring again and again with incessant repetition. I was trying to escape from Mount Edgemont by night and could not. The figure I had seen in the room in the tower a few evenings ago and led me astray in the corridors of the castle, leaving me at last standing at the door of Lady Evelyn's boudoir, where I entered to find her as I had found her that evening, fastening a fresh rose in her hair before the mirror. Then the vision vanished, and the dream and the unsuccessful flight began afresh, until at last I shrieked aloud in my anguish and awoke. For an instant I still imagined I was dreaming, for there, not 3 paces from my bed, standing in the moonlight which shone through the window casement into the room, I saw that strange figure once more, its eyes now fixed upon me with a stern, angry look. As I started up, it raised both arms aloft and shook them menacingly. With a loud cry I sprang out of bed and rushed at the spectre, but before I reached the spot it was gone. At that moment I heard a succession of cries, which seemed to come from someone beneath my window, and almost simultaneously there was a sharp rapping at my door, and I heard a voice outside call to me to open. Utterly bewildered, I unlocked the door, only to start back with an exclamation of astonishment. The person who now entered hurriedly, and with signs of extreme agitation on his face, was no other than the Duke of Teignmouth himself. "Where is Lord Bertie?" he asked. "His room is empty." "Great God, if it should be true!" "Goring?" I exclaimed. "What has happened to him?" "I fear he has met with foul play, Morton," the old Duke said with a white face. "I am not usually affected by dreams, but this one was fearful. I say, hark, what is that?" He broke off as the cries beneath my window sounded again, louder than before. I rushed to the casement, flung it open, and looked out. The next moment I fell back, laughing. In the snow, just underneath my window, hammering with all his might against the door which led from this wing of the castle onto the terrace, stood Lord Bertie. He was, I blush to say it, in his nightshirt. How he had got there, heaven knew. But I did not stop to think or explain. Seizing the lighted candle which the Duke held in his hand, I hurried out of the room, followed by his Grace himself, and passing quickly through the corridor and down the staircase, unbolted the door and let the unfortunate fellow in. At the sight of the Duke he looked somewhat confused, but his pale face showed he was suffering more from fright than embarrassment. "How the deuce did you get out there, Goring?" I cried. "You must have climbed out of the window. This door here was locked and bolted." It was some time before he could find speech to explain. "I've had the most extraordinary experience," he stuttered at last. "Woke up about half an hour ago, almost strangled by some masquerading fellow who had got into my room somehow. When I tried to seize him, he was out of the door like a shot, and I after him. He led me a regular dance, upstairs and downstairs, till at last he disappeared out of this door, and I, like a fool, followed. When I got outside, he was no more to be seen, and when I wanted to get back again, I found the door wouldn't open," he added viciously. The Duke listened in silence, but his face was very grave, and he glanced at me with a curious look of interest, which emboldened me to relate my own second adventure with the ghost that night. He said nothing, save to request Goring and myself to keep the matter quiet. But when we had lighted Goring, all shivering and quaking with cold, to his room, the Duke stopped for a moment at my door and said, "I should like to see you tomorrow again for a few minutes before you go, Ralph. Good night." And with these words he left me. Ralph, Ralph, I kept repeating to myself as I pondered over his speech. The old Duke had not called me by my Christian name since I was at school at Eton. The next morning at 10 o'clock I presented myself in the Duke's study with a heavy heart. On my way there I had passed the conservatory, where I had seen Lady Evelyn walking with Bertie Goring, who, by the way, was afflicted with an awful cold, and by her embarrassed air and his animated manner I had little difficulty in guessing the nature of their interview. "Sit down, Morton," said his Grace when I entered. "There are one or two things I wish to say to you." I bowed silently. I was only too well aware of the fact. "It is Goring's own wish to have his answer direct from her," he continued. "You probably know what it will be, Morton." "Your Grace," I stammered, half ashamed and half angry at what I thought a cruel and unbecoming jest. "Well, well," he said, "Evelyn has told me that her affections have been engaged elsewhere since several years, and though I may frankly tell you that under ordinary conditions I could never have consented to such a match. Not that I have any objection to your personal character, my dear boy." I started up electrified, nearly knocking down my chair in amazement. "There are certain circumstances," the Duke went on, "which I dare not ignore, and which lead me to believe that you will make Evelyn a good husband. Stay," he continued in a lower voice, seeing my moment of delirious joy. "There is one other matter which I wish to tell you about, and which may perhaps explain a good deal that has seemed incomprehensible to you. 300 years ago, Morton, an ancestor of mine gave his only daughter away in marriage to a rich but profligate and brutal nobleman. Her husband ill-treated her, and she died broken-hearted, for she had loved a better man. His father challenged his own son-in-law to mortal combat and killed him, after which he shut himself up in this very castle, Mount Edgemont, and died 2 years later, overwhelmed with shame and remorse. This is a matter of common historical knowledge. What is less commonly known is that ever since that time no aspirant to the hand of a daughter of the Delisles has escaped a visitation from the spectre of that most unhappy of fathers, who signifies his approval or disapproval of the intended alliance in an unmistakable manner, and woe to him who disregards it. The figure you saw and followed on that night of the ball was the ghost of my unfortunate ancestor. Had you frankly told me the end of your adventure, which I only learned yesterday from Evelyn's lips, you might have been spared the mortification you have undergone." He rose as he spoke the last words, and laid his hand kindly upon my shoulder. Then he touched a bell on his table and ordered the servant who entered to tell Lady Evelyn that he wished to have a few moments' conversation with her. What I said and did I haven't the slightest recollection. I only know that when Lady Evelyn entered her father's study a few minutes later, she found me there alone, and stood blushing and confused on the threshold. What thereupon took place, however, I remember with a distinctness that will never fade, but I fear it would scarcely sound new to anyone, except perhaps the doughty reader whom I apostrophised at the commencement of my story, and him or her, as the case may be, it would presumably not interest at all. Besides, one must draw the line somewhere, even in a ghost story. Considering that I had never made love to Lady Evelyn, it may seem strange to say that not 30 seconds after she had entered the room, all trace of embarrassment had vanished both from her face and mine. But then, what else but a strange sequel could be expected to so strange a wooing?